On this edition of Great Lakes Now, shoreline communities grapple with high water and erosion.
For all these years, we've drifted along without a policy on how close can you build to the lake.
Can colleges fight COVID-19 by testing wastewater?
From there, we can actually pinpoint where it is because we're sampling at the dormitory level.
And 30 years after the zebra mussel invasion, how are Great Lakes ecosystems adapting?
This program is brought to you by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Lori and Tim Wadhams.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
The Richard C. Devereaux Foundation for Energy and Environmental Programs at DPTV, the Polk Family Fund, Eve and Jerry Young, the Brookby Foundation, Founders Brewing Company, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ward Detweiler. Welcome back to Great Lakes Now. Record-setting high water has raised erosion concerns around the Great Lakes Basin, prompting some shoreline communities to rethink their policies on waterfront construction and shoreline armoring. The next story is a collaboration with Bridge, Michigan.
Residents in communities along the Great Lakes have been battling up and down water levels for generations. Water levels hit all-time lows in 2013, and then in 2019, new highs were recorded all around the Great Lakes, and water levels have remained high ever since. Brant Rousseau is the supervisor of Port Austin Township at the tip of Michigan's thumb. He's also a member of the Port Austin Planning Commission.
There's been damage to private property. People have lost land. There's been serious erosion. We've had problems with our public parks, both state-owned parks, county parks, and municipal parks. Damage to structures, and overall, we've seen that we haven't had a plan in place to try to deal with some of these issues as best we could.
Port Austin Township is one of only a handful of coastal communities along the Great Lakes that are working to revise their master plans to address issues of erosion.
There's a panic. The residents are taking matters into their own hands, right? With or without permits, all over the state.
We headed out with Brant and charter fishing captain Ray Boswell to survey the Lake Huron shoreline just off of Grindstone City near Port Austin. We were joined by Kelly House, an environmental reporter for Bridge Magazine, who has done extensive reporting on erosion along the Great Lakes.
How does it feel to you as a community leader to see the pain that your community is going through right now?
I've been at the coastline with some of our residents, literally whose front porch is about to go into the lake. Mm-hmm. And with that comes the fear that the house is next. You'll have people starting to have to move their houses, like is happening in places throughout the state.
Along the shoreline, many are hoping for a return to normal, but there's really no normal place for the water's edge. It's a moving target. Guy Meadows is the director of the Marine Engineering Laboratory at Michigan Technological University's Great Lakes Research Center.
The Great Lakes are relatively new features, geologically speaking. They're very steep-sided and deep, and the natural process is to broaden those basins and to begin to fill in the deep parts of the lake. And that background process we call background erosion. The lakes are getting wider, the shore is moving landward at about 1 foot per year for Lake Michigan's and Lake Huron.
That background erosion can be concealed by the rise and fall of the lakes, which makes the beaches shrink and swell. But the long-term trend is clear.
You are always losing shoreline in the long term. It's very hard to perceive that because it happens on scales that are on the order of 15 to 30 years.
For decades, a common way of responding to erosion has been shoreline armoring, usually with a seawall made of steel or stone. Tony Gutierrez lives along the lake in Grindstone City. Over the past 2 years, he's piled more than 200 tons of rock on an existing break wall in an effort to keep the waves at bay. Even with all that stone, Tony knows the winter may bring a wave of new challenges.
Yeah, we're a little concerned about the ice. The ice flows can get, pretty massive here. And this is the highest the water's been since we've been here. And going into the winter, we're expecting to have some issues with ice up against the shore. It's going to move some of that rock a little bit, but, Mother Nature has the last laugh. I mean, it's just the way it is.
But shoreline armoring isn't really a permanent solution. The problem is that armoring the shoreline can actually make erosion worse. Steel and stone don't absorb or dissipate wave energy, they reflect it. And that reflected wave energy can move beach sand off the shore and out into the lake.
So on a natural beach, as water level rises and storm energy rises, the beach readjusts itself in terms of its slope and the placement of offshore sandbars to be as dissipative as possible to that new environment. If we come along and plunk in armoring or a jetty or some alteration of that shoreline, that inhibits the beach's ability to naturally adjust itself for the incoming changes in wave conditions.
Ironically, in the long run, shoreline armoring will destroy the very beach it's intended to protect. But homeowners have few options when it comes to preserving their property. As Kelly House has reported, the state of Michigan has granted more than 2,200 seawall permits in the past year. That's more than 3 times the number it granted the year before.
For a lot of these people, it becomes, a push and pull between this immediate need to not have your home fall into the lake and the long-term consequences of the decisions we make now that can ultimately worsen erosion over time or simply just not work long-term. So if you're one of those landowners, it's something that people are having to grapple with. And it's something that communities are grappling with on the larger scale as they do these planning processes.
Many communities, like Port Austin Township, don't have rules in place for how close a home can be built to the water. So now, they're reevaluating their planning policies, trying to support local landowners, and at the same time protect the beaches that are vital to their tourism industry.
So for all these years, we've drifted along without a policy on how close can you build to the lake. Well, when the water's low, you have all this extra real estate, you can walk along the seashore, and now that the water's high, people are now having to deal with the fact that they built far too close to the shoreline.
Solutions may include creating ordinances that require new homes to set back from the shoreline as much as possible, and for new homes to be small enough to be moved if and when it becomes necessary. Dick Norton, a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan, is working with officials in Port Austin and coastal communities throughout the state to develop master plans that reflect the need to preserve the beaches.
So the first thing we ought to do is think carefully about the places that have not yet developed and make sure that we don't make the problem worse. The second step is to think through for the places that have armored, what do we do now? Do we tell them you're going to have to take that armoring out at some point? Do we tell them you can keep it there, but you can't repair it? So nature is going to keep working on those seawalls, and they're going to fail eventually. And maybe what we say is you can enjoy your property while you have it and enjoy that seawall while you have it. But when the time comes that it's failing, then you need to take it out and try and get back to a natural shoreline. Or do we just decide the folks who have armored, all right, you're done it, you've got it, you can just keep it armored and do that knowing we're probably going to lose the beach.
Only a handful of the more than 300 coastal communities in Michigan have started the process of creating plans to deal with erosion issues. But increased awareness may be critical as communities face tough choices moving forward.
I think people are much more aware of the physical processes that are ongoing and the impact on the shoreline. There's been tremendous interest in preserving the public trust beach, preserving the beach as a beach where people can enjoy and walk and picnic and swim with relative safety, and not to create an armored shoreline that exists from the Straits of Mackinac to the Indiana border. So I think there is much more awareness of the long-term impacts than there ever have been before. So I think I'm optimistic that we will change our view of how we occupy the shoreline.
We have more on the effects of high water and erosion, including a link to Kelly House's full story at greatlakesnow.org. The COVID-19 pandemic poses real health and safety challenges for administrators at colleges and universities. Some schools in our region have begun using a promising approach for detecting potential outbreaks.
Tens of thousands of students return to college campuses across the country this fall. With the growing threat of COVID-19, universities scrambled to find ways to keep students safe. The key to returning to a normal face-to-face college experience may lie in the ability to identify an outbreak of the virus early and take action to contain it before it spreads. Dr. David Larson is an associate professor of public health at Syracuse University in New York.
And we're going to be with this pandemic for a long time. We're at least a year and a half away from a vaccinated population. And so we have to learn to engage safely, socially when we can, and then to pull back when the transmission warrants.
Syracuse University is using an early warning system to try and detect the virus on campus. Prithvi Kilaru is a program manager in the university's Department of Public Health.
Sample collection bottle, battery. All right, let's go.
He's hoping to identify infected students before they can spread the virus to others by strategically sampling campus wastewater.
Whenever someone gets COVID-19, they actually shed the virus in their stool, and it shows up in the wastewater. So we're gonna open this up.
Traces of the virus can be detected in wastewater up to 10 days before an infected person starts to show symptoms.
And we get bits and pieces in the wastewater of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19. And we can take those little bits and we can analyze them in the lab to see, was there ever SARS-CoV-2 in the wastewater? And from there, we can actually pinpoint where it is because we're sampling at the dormitory level.
The first stage of sample collection is done automatically, daily and nightly, by a number of composite samplers running in nondescript boxes around the university grounds.
That's the sample right there. The box is actually unique. It's a wastewater sampler, a composite sampler that I designed and built myself. But what that box was doing was what every other composite sampler does.
Specifically, it pulls samples of wastewater from the campus sewer system throughout the day and combines 24 hours of samples into a single composite sample.
This is the sample itself. And that's over a 24-hour period. Overall, there's 96 collections because we're collecting every 15 minutes. We basically just swirl this around, and then we want to put it away from us because there's fumes generated when you shake this. So all we do, grab the bottle, we open up the container, transfer it to this. And the reason we do that is it's because it's the most representative of how people are using the system. But if we do it over a 24-hour period, we catch as many people as possible that are using that system.
Once analyzed, this wastewater should indicate whether anybody living in that building has the virus in their system. The university collects wastewater samples from 19 residence halls that house more than 6,000 students.
We have realized that wastewater gives you an early warning. It tells you something is about to happen. If you have an action plan for when you get that signal, you could be prepared, in some cases weeks ahead of time, or at least days ahead of time, for what's about to happen. And if you have that early warning and you're prepared, you can mitigate some of these outbreaks.
If the virus is detected in wastewater from a residence hall, students living in that building are tested. Anyone that tests positive can be quarantined potentially days or even a week before they begin to show symptoms. Without the wastewater testing system, they could unknowingly infect dozens of others on campus.
You can then layer on testing to try to find virus, wastewater surveillance to tell us where to test, and aggressive contact tracing to contain the virus when it arrives.
As useful as this detection technique is, though, there are limitations. That's because, just like the virus can show up in the sample before a person starts showing symptoms, traces of the virus can also remain in the sample long after they've recovered, So when the virus is detected, there's still some uncertainty.
We can't say who has it, but we can say someone in that building has it or has had it. The reason I say has had it is because you can continue to shed the virus 2 to 4 weeks after you're infected.
Public health specialists say the key to using the data collected from the wastewater is to pay attention to the trend in the sample, not just the presence of the virus.
So if that trend line is going down, maybe people are recovering. And that's not as big a deal as if all of a sudden we have one number 1 week and all of a sudden it spikes up again. That might suggest that, hey, someone might be infectious right now and they're shedding the virus. And so we base our decisions off of the trend rather than the absolute number.
Keeping tabs on the virus helps students, faculty, and administrators make decisions that will protect their health.
My personal behavior is going to depend on what's transmission like where I live. And so if transmission is controlled, then we're going to do things like visit grandma, go to the park, open up the schools. And when it goes up, we can kind of scale back on that.
A number of other colleges and universities across the country, including the University of Arizona, Virginia Tech, and Eastern Michigan University, are turning to wastewater sampling to stop the spread of COVID-19 on campus. But the approach is also being introduced at the county level in wastewater systems around the country.
So if you found it in like a large-scale population, it's not feasible to test everyone. At the county level, what they can do is they can prepare for an outbreak using wastewater. So wastewater will actually give you an early warning whether to expect a spike in cases or not, and they can use that to prepare. But after that, it's mostly retroactive work.
Syracuse University is hoping this testing will help keep the incidence of the virus in check until a vaccine can be developed and new policies can be implemented to protect the health and safety of everyone on campus.
Nothing in the world has the capacity to disrupt our daily lives like an infectious disease pandemic. You know, if I had a crystal ball, I would guess that maybe a year and a half from now, we have a fully vaccinated population, we're back to a level of normal. Where I hope this takes us is to a safer place as a country and as a world where we institute systems and policies to keep us safe from infectious disease.
For more on how the Great Lakes region has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, visit greatlakesnow.org. More than 180 invasive species have entered the Great Lakes. Zebra mussels and round goby arrived in the lakes more than 30 years ago, and the lakes are still adapting to the change.
3 of the best-known invasive species in the Great Lakes arrived from the same place. Zebra mussels, quagga mussels, and round gobies all came here from halfway across the world, carried in ballast water by ocean-going freighters.
We kind of got a transplanted ecosystem from the Black and Caspian Seas. And actually around 1988, the first zebra mussels were picked up in the St. Clair River.
Zebra mussels quickly multiplied and began causing problems by clogging intakes at water treatment plants and power plants. It was anybody's guess how the ecosystem would respond.
They come into a system, explode, and then you have all the different forces of predators, parasites, limiting food supplies. They all come to act on the population.
But even before native species could adapt to the presence of zebra mussels, a new aquatic invader showed up and changed things again: the quagga mussel. Harvey Bootsma is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences.
Initially, the zebra mussels really took off, but they were confined to the edges of the lakes because they live on hard substrate. But a little bit later, the quagga mussel came in, and the quagga mussel can live in colder water and it can live on soft bottom, so it spread much more widely than the zebra mussels did, and it replaced the zebra mussels.
Bootsma and a team of researchers have discovered something surprising about mussels in Lake Michigan.
We wanted to see if there was any potential for controlling mussels, at least at a small scale, in Lake Michigan. So in 2016, with support from the National Park Service and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we decided to start a mussel removal project.
The research was done on a rocky reef in Good Harbor Bay between Leland, Michigan and Sleeping Bear National Lake Shore. There, a team of volunteer divers spent weeks scraping mussels off of rocks.
The number of volunteer divers working with us spent several weeks that summer just going down, diving, and scraping the mussels off of rocks, trying to create a significantly large area that was mussel-free. And then after that, the objective was to monitor that to see what happened to that patch of rock.
Surprisingly, 4 years later, there are still almost no mussels in the area. The research team suspected round gobies might be responsible.
We think what's happening is the mussel larvae, or what are called veligers, settle on surfaces where they grow into hard-shelled mussels. If mussels try to recolonize these rocks, the gobies are eating them before they can grow to any significant size.
To test that hypothesis, the researchers put in devices called Hester Dindy traps, which have spaces in them that are big enough for mussels but too small for gobies.
And sure enough, we're seeing mussels in those traps now. So it does seem like the gobies are instrumental in keeping the mussels from recolonizing the rocks that we cleared some time ago.
And taking the mussels away had other effects too.
Where we removed the mussels, we've also seen a huge drop in other invertebrates because they just don't have anywhere to hide anymore. So amphipods are a big one. Another one is isopods. Fish love to eat them if they can get at them. There's actually more of them now than there used to be because the mussel beds provide lots of food for them and they provide hiding places for them.
But once the mussel beds were gone, the fish could gobble up on the invertebrates while the gobies munched on mussel larvae.
Ironically, an invasive species, the round goby, it may be helping to control another invasive species, the quagga mussel, by feeding on them.
Round gobies come from the same place as zebra mussels and arrived in the Great Lakes around the same time. Gobies can displace native fish partly because of their spawning habits.
One of their successes is that males guard the nests. As a result of that, they get a high fertility rate, and females can spawn, I think, every 2 weeks. And so they start in May and they spawn all the way through to September. Most fish, they spawn in the spring. If they get a bad spring, they lose the whole larval fish cohort for that particular time, but not round gobies. If they're spawning, for 4 months, one of those times they're going to hit the perfect storm of good conditions for their survival and produce a lot of larval round gobies. And then the second big reason is quagga and zebra mussels, and that's a tremendously huge food supply for them.
For years, native species ignored the gobies, but things have changed. Today, natives across the basin are adjusting to their presence in surprising ways, and round goby have become a daily special on the Great Lakes menu.
Once they became abundant, fish, walleyes, northern pike, and smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass particularly really zeroed in on them. They're well known for eating crayfish. Their diet's really full of crayfish and other benthic fish like darters. So the gobies were a natural for them. It took a while, but they figured out how to catch them.
Native species like sculpin hide from bass by freezing and blending in, so that's what the bass are used to. But gobies have a different way to avoid being eaten, and it took the bass by surprise.
Because they have this strange behavior that when you scare them, they just kind of shoot out in one direction or another. That's one of the interesting things, that there was definitely a learning curve for these predators in how to catch these round gobies, and they learned how to do it.
And smallmouth bass aren't the only native predator to start feeding on gobies.
The other one that has recently been found to eat a lot of round gobies are the lake trout. We've been seeing some really big changes in their diets as they're shifting from fish like mottled sculpins and alewives to round gobies.
Another interesting story is the Lake Erie water snake, which previously was endangered, and they've made a real comeback because they love to eat gobies as well. So those are really interesting questions as we're going forward. What's the new Lake Michigan going to look like, and are there fish that are able to actually take advantage of this new situation?
The story of the mussel and goby invasion of the Great Lakes is still unfolding, but the impact has already been huge. The mussels have filtered the lakes, removing algae and absorbing industrial waste, making the waters clearer.
They're shifting back to more of the state they were before man interfered and changed everything. And so we're certainly getting close to that state.
What it all means for the lakes is still unknown.
Lake Michigan is like a moving target right now. We're trying to understand it, but the way the lake works is changing while we're trying to understand how the lake works.
Thanks for watching. We're very proud of Great Lakes Now because we've received a leadership award recognizing communication excellence from the Great Lakes Protection Fund. Find out more about this honor and about all the stories in this episode, including a quiz that will tell you which invasive species you're most like, at greatlakesnow.org. When you get there, you can follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter to get updates about our work. See you out on the lakes.
This program is brought to you by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Lori and Tim Wadhams.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
The Richard C. Devereaux Foundation for Energy and Environmental Programs at DPTV, the Polk Family Fund, Eve and Jerry Young, the Brookby Foundation, Founders Brewing Company, and viewers like you. Thank you.